In this session, we will discuss sentence complexity. How do we analyze the complexity of a sentence and then teach it to students in meaningful and comprehensible ways? Before we dig into how to do that, we want to discuss why it's so important to consider sentence complexity. Before moving on, make sure you have read the second half of the Fillmore and Fillmore article on this. So why is it important to consider sentence complexity? The biggest reason is that students need to learn how to gain access to ideas that are coded in complex text and language. It begins with close reading of complex text. Further discussing how we consider sentence complexity, Fillmore and Fillmore suggest using a daily instructional session where teachers lead students in a discussion that's focused on just one sentence drawn from the text the students are working on. In these conversations, the goal is to help students unpack the information that's in the sentence. Sometimes we take for granted how tightly packed information is in academic text. Once students have unpacked this information with you, it helps them gradually internalize an awareness of the relation between specific linguistic patterns and the functions that they serve in text. When selecting a sentence, you want to pick one that is begging to be unwrapped, that has important complexity in it as well as important meaning. One of the biggest pieces is that what you do with the text is tied to meaning. A good way to think about this is to check and make sure that the point of the sentence is important to the meaning of the text, and that it's not simply just a complex sentence. Before we move on to thinking about how we actually do this, I would like you to pause this video and read the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. You can find this linked in your agenda. As you are reading, you might want to circle or note some sentences that you would think would be great for unpacking complexity. We will use one juicy sentence from this selection as our example. Take some time now to read. There are just a few steps when thinking about sentence complexity. The first step is to find one juicy sentence in the bigger text that you are using with students. I'm sure you found lots of great sentences when you read the I Have a Dream speech. For the purposes of our example, we're going to use this sentence. Take a moment and read it. Already, this checks out as being very complex and also important to some deeper meaning that is in Martin Luther King's speech or text. Step 2 then is to take that great sentence that you found and chunk it. Think about what needs to be unwrapped. What are the different parts of the sentence that might be saying different things or require you to reference different parts of the text or ideas? So let's look at this sentence. The way we've chunked this out is in 3 areas. There is no minimum or maximum of chunks that you need to chunk a sentence in. Simply do what makes sense for the sentence and the complexity and where you need to stop and make sure students understand the meaning, as well as teach them how to make sense of it eventually on their own. You can see that we've chunked it into the 3 areas: this momentous degree, a great beacon of hope, who have been seared in the flames of withering injustice. Step 3 is to consider how to teach each chunk and what you want to point out as you look at each chunk with students. Let's take the first chunk, this momentous degree. In this area, the teacher says that he or she would model for students how this is referring back to the previous sentence in the larger text, where Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is being referenced. The teacher would want to take time to build background around Lincoln and that whole period of time and what that decree entailed. Things like videos or pictures might be used. Or students can share what they know about that point in history and what they know about Lincoln and what he meant for slavery. For chunk 2, the teacher would focus on this part, a great beacon light of hope. This is really a metaphor. So if students hadn't explored that literary device in a while, this would be a great time to review the idea of a metaphor, focusing on that idea that it's a comparison. The beacon light of hope is what the Emancipation Proclamation is being compared to. Students really need to understand this to understand the complexity of what Martin Luther is saying. The teacher suggests showing a visual of a beacon, maybe from a lighthouse or other picture, and discuss why that might be related to the Emancipation Proclamation, why people might see that as a beacon of light, light then being again compared to hope. Then help students see how this continued to relate to the first clause of the sentence, as well as the sentence before that, again going back to the Emancipation Proclamation. In the third chunk, the teacher would focus on who have been seared in the flames of withering injustice. This would be the focus of the discussion. First, students could discuss withering injustice. What is withering injustice? Students will have to draw a conclusion that it's relating back to slavery. Yet again, another metaphor. Then the sentence goes on to say, seared in the flames. So slavery is really being compared to this fiery hell of flames. There are multiple metaphors in this one sentence, and this would create rich discussion and drawing meaning out for students. After you've chunked the sentence and thought through how each piece would be taught, then you want to put it all back together again. This supports the research-based idea of whole part whole. Whole part whole ensures meaning. We start with a bigger picture, break it into smaller chunks, and then make sure it's being connected back to the whole big meaning. Remember, it's going to be hard to put it back together to one big meaning if it's not an important idea in the text. So remember that when picking the sentence, you want to call out for students that it is an important idea to the text. You can see here what the teacher wants to highlight when students put it back together. She summarizes, in this one sentence, King begins with an allusion to President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. So the beginning of Martin Luther's speech is hopeful, but it hints at the idea that not all is right. The metaphors hint at the change that's just around the corner, and that the Emancipation Proclamation will hopefully now actually be fulfilled. The teacher says to put it all back together, she would allow students to work in pairs or trios with some other supports like sentence starters and the visuals that they've used to understand the sentence so far. Here, he or she writes out some possible starters or frames that the students might use to be successful. Before trying to do this with a sentence from one of your own text, I'd like you to pause this video again and go back to your online agenda. There is a video linked called Butterfly. This video shows how some teachers supported some kindergartners with sentence complexity. Yes, students at all ages can benefit from this strategy. As you watch the video entitled Butterfly, use the graphic organizer that's at the bottom of your agenda to record your thinking and the reflections on the video. Once you've watched the video and seen how it's done, come back to this video so that we can finish up. Now it's your turn to try. Please go back to the text that you have used to do your bigger text complexity with the four-square matrix, and simply pick one important sentence out of that text that you would want to analyze with students. Remember, step 1 is to pick a juicy sentence, meaning a sentence that connects to bigger important ideas. Step 2 then is to chunk the sentence. Again, there is no minimum or maximum of chunks, simply what it's requiring. Once you have chunked the sentence, You want to think about how you would teach each piece of the chunk to students. Finally, you want to put it all back together with the bigger meaning and purpose by engaging students in yet another discussion and interaction to make meaning of the text. There is a graphic organizer in your agenda to help you do this. You will attach this to your larger text complexity analysis. Good luck and have fun.